the register.
A new levy and tax will ensure that industry does contribute. Building owners and industry should make buildings safe without passing on costs to leaseholders. We're examining the support offer for residents in 11 to 18 metre buildings where the fire risk is lower. The government has stated leaseholders should not be paying for excessive building safety costs, and the Secretary of State is looking into the issue closely.
My Lords, we're at this issue again, and I would like the Noble Lord to set out for the House what actual additional measures to those previously announced the Noble Lord intends to take to protect the innocent victims of this scandal.
My Lords, it's for my right honourable friend to set out this approach. It's entirely proper that he should do that, and is undertaken to do that. He set out the principles around greater proportionality, protecting leaseholders, and also getting the polluter to pay, as I've said previously at the dispatch box. And I think we've got to wait for that detailed announcement. But I've taken a personal interest. I've called in registered social landlords that seem to be passing on costs to shared owners and leaseholders and held them to account. So the Chief Executive of Optivo has now indicated to me that they are not proceeding ahead with costly remediation for Oyster Court, and they're not going ahead with remediation in Mill Court. And I'm calling in another RSL, Shepherd's Bush Housing Group, that seems to be considering passing on costs on a medium rise to shared owners that don't have the bandwidth to be able to pay that, because actually Shepherd's Bush Housing were the original developer and they were subsidised to do development. And I think it's wrong that these registered social landlords in some cases are seeking to pass the costs on to people whose shoulders are not broad enough to bear them.
My Lords, one of the very serious results of this problem is that many people are desperate to move but simply cannot sell their properties any longer. And this is causing huge difficulties when people are trying to get jobs in other parts of the country. What assessment has Her Majesty's Government made of the Welsh Government's proposal to start buying some of those properties that can't be sold for the moment and then turning them into affordable housing and social housing and so on as a way of trying to break the deadlock?
My Lords, I'd always love a magic bullet. The reality is that the cladding crisis and the building safety crisis in Wales is a fraction of the scale in England. It's just a fact. I can give you the statistics if you're interested. But we aren't going to solve it through that. But what we do need to have is a greater sense of proportion. We have made this a bigger scandal than it needs to be because too many buildings are being declared unsafe that are perfectly safe. And frankly, there's an industry profiteering on the back of this. And we need to do something about that. And what there needs to be is a call for innovation to encourage mitigation more often than not than full-scale costly remediation. Because we need to make sure that there's an adequate, sensible, proportionate approach to this crisis.
Our benches so far, so if I may intervene at this stage. On behalf of my noble friend Baroness Cumnock, who can't be here, can I ask the Minister, the Government intended that Grenfell-style cladding on social housing would be removed by the end of 2019, yet another broken promise. It's reported that the earliest this will be achieved is 2024. Can the Minister confirm that report, and what action is the Government taking to speed up the process and indeed to support those affected?
I know there's the sort of broken promises line, but the reality is that 95% of ACM buildings have been remediated. And actually, we accelerated at pace whilst I've been Building Safety Minister, despite the fact that there's a global pandemic. And the reality is many buildings, about 20 of them, a lot of them happen to be in the London Borough of Southwark, by the way, were only discovered only literally months ago that they had ACM cladding. I'm not blaming you, the Noble Lord. So we're doing our best. This is tough, and I don't think it's something that we should score points over something like this. We're absolutely committed to remediate these particularly aluminium composite material. That is the most deadly form of cladding, and I have to say, very shortly we will have that removed on all buildings in this country.
My Lord, since we last discussed this matter, thousands of leaseholders will have received on January the 1st service charges from the freeholder, demanding very substantial remediation sums which aren't affordable for many of these leaseholders, which will lead to either repossession or bankruptcy. Now, while the Government has provided substantial support, which I welcome, does my noble friend recognise that this is insufficient to prevent hardship? And will he have urgent discussions with a view to raising more resources, possibly through a levy, from those developers and other builders responsible for the defects in the first place?
Well, my noble friend is someone with decades of experience, literally decades of experience in government, and they know that things like levies and taxes is a matter for Treasury. But what I would say is that not just my department, but others have gone through countless numbers of fire risk assessments and external wall surveys, and there are so many, literally littered examples of people that did not build to building regulations, that cut corners, that use, I think the noble Lord Lytton, if he's here, the value engineering to make a bit more profit. And the reality is we can't keep looking to Treasury to keep bailing everybody out. We've got to get the polluter to pay.
The noble Lord the Minister's frustration that he's not in a position to launch a magic bullet or even to make an announcement today. So might he instead just share some of his own developing thinking? Following on from the very constructive suggestion from his noble friend Lord Cookham, why not a legislative scheme to immunise the victims and take from those who've been unjustly enriched?
I'll take that as a helpful interjection. But I do think we need to think about how we protect leaseholders, and sometimes statutory protection is a good thing, and you know that the Building Safety Bill that will have finished the committee stage in the House provides a vehicle to do precisely that, but I can't say any more on the subject.
Minister, what the government's response is to the statement from the chair of the board of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors on the 10th of December, in which they call for the EWS1 checks not to be scrapped for buildings under 18 metres, and estimate that there are 77,500 low-rise buildings which need fire remediation work doing urgently at an estimated cost of £15 billion.
Well, I have to say we've got quite a lot of data on the number of medium-rise buildings, and what I can say is there are far more medium-rise buildings than there are high-rise buildings, and the figure of 77 or 75,000 is broadly correct. But the number within that require remediation is very small indeed. I can't give you those statistics, but I have seen our survey work, and the number requiring mitigation is also very small. And frankly, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors seem to be more interested in how they can raise money to surveyors than being proportionate in terms of the approach towards this crisis.
Nevertheless, does my noble friend recognise that there is great hardship in significant numbers of people who are stuck in the middle? And will he look, I can speak as someone who was a former chairman of the Housing Committee in the London Borough of Islington. I'm sure that the local authority housing would, if put to it properly, be willing to look at taking over a limited number of flats to ensure that those who have to move can move.
Well, someone who's served in London local government in I think in Llandaff? No, Islington, sorry, that's North London, yeah. I mean, we'll have experience, obviously, of public housing, and I was obviously leader of Hammersmith and Fulham for 6 years and a councillor there for 16 years. And of course, when it comes to public housing or social housing, there are things that you can do. But this is something that goes right across the built environment, both private housing and public housing. So of course we'll look at measures, but that's obviously driven through local government. But that's not going to solve this crisis in the round. And you have to wait the announcement from my right honourable friend in the other place.
Not suggest that the arbitrary line of 18 metres has led to much of this confusion and the fact that people feel that they've been trapped. Can the government please give us an assurance they won't make that sort of arbitrary line in future?
I have to say it's not arbitrary. It's well established that 18 metres is the cut-off point for a high-rise building. It helps you categorise buildings. You know, we do it in stories as well, because we've had the cube, which I think was 17.5 metres in height rather than 18 metres, anything above 6 stories. But it helps us understand the scale of the problem. And the reality is the scale of the problem is far greater in high-rise buildings where you can't get the ladders up tall buildings. Actually, firefighting, as many will know, and I'm happy to be the Fire Minister as well, it's much harder to help evacuate buildings in high-rises than it is in medium or low-rise buildings. And therefore, I think it is right to have this, whilst we don't have but we will have something called the PAS 9980 that will help risk stratify the problem irrespective of height, and that's something that will be introduced shortly.
That has effectively conceded that this has dragged on far too long. And he said in reply to the question from my noble friend Lord Kennedy that his right honourable friend, not him as the responsible minister, but his right honourable friend, is going to make a detailed announcement soon. Could he tell the House when will that announcement be made? People want to know.
When it's happened, people will know. But it's important, it's important. It's important to understand that this department, under the leadership of the Secretary of State, worked incredibly hard coming up with a comprehensive response to this crisis, something that I've said already in this House has taken decades to come to this point, and we've needed some months to come forward, and that announcement will be happening very soon. I won't use the in due course line.
Fourth oral question, Lord McConnell.